Well, a very good afternoon to everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is O.P. Ayler and I am a founding partner here at Maxica Consulting. We are a business and IT management consultancy specializing in IT strategy and transformation design and in the effective delivery of change. Our expertise is broad, covers both the private and public sector. We've worked across manufacturing, aerospace, pharma, UK higher education, retail, and charities, among others. Our clients benefit from our strong delivery capabilities and partnership focus. This enables them to deploy the right capabilities at the right time. And given the complexity and uncertainty that typically accompanies change delivery, the flexibility of our services has enabled our clients to deliver change at the right pace. And over the next 45 minutes today, we will explore some of the key lessons that have been learned from the field, battle scars, if you like, or victory scars, as you might want to see them, earned regarding how to unlock digital transformation success. And just for the benefit of everyone, kind of level setting, by digital transformation, we mean the transformation of the culture, capabilities, whether those are systems, technologies, processes, or people, by which an organization delivers its mandate. Today, our discussion will begin with our webinar will begin with a discussion session with our panelists. And then at the end, we will take some questions from the audience. At some point during the webinar today, we will administer a poll, which I would really strongly encourage you to kindly respond to. If you would like to ask questions, then do please use the chat function within the webinar today. And you can ask the questions at any time, but your questions will be collated by our moderators. And we will then ask them as many as we can get through at the end. We will try to take as many as we can. This webinar is being recorded. And therefore, if you would rather not be on camera, do please turn off your camera now. The webinar is being recorded, and a recording of the webinar will be available shortly after the session ends. You'll be able to download this on demand, either on LinkedIn and certainly at the Maxica website, which is www.maxica.com. It is now my real pleasure and privilege to introduce our two speakers, our two panelists today. Mark Barry has held several IT leadership roles in a multitude of organizations in both the private and public sectors. He's worked across retail, pharmacy, higher education, insurance, consumer packaging, manufacturing, healthcare manufacturing, distribution and automotive manufacturing. So a really broad base of experience there from Mark. And after serving at the CIO at Boots UK, where he successfully delivered significant transformation programs in digital, pharmacy, and optician operations, while reorganizing at the same time the IT division, Mark took on the role of IT director at the University of East Anglia, UEA, a role which he held from 2018 till 2022, when he kind of set down a little bit, I think, some of the reins, in sort of partial retirement. Mark still keeps coming back for more, though, I must say. At the UEA, Mark oversaw the technology changes required to support the university's COVID-19 response. And working effectively with the University Council and stakeholders, he launched an ambitious digital transformation program, which was aimed primarily at modernizing the university's aging IT estate and delivering a slick and modern student experience. Kevin Adams is our other panelist today. He's an experienced senior leader with over 25 years senior level management and strategic experience in change and technology. Lots of FTSE 100, FTSE 250 company experience. Some of the big names, such as British Telecom, or now BT, TUI Travel, Amy, Cable and Wireless, Mega Aerospace, are some of the organizations where Kevin has held some very senior roles. He is a BCS Fellow Assessor and he's also a member of the prestigious CIO 100. Kevin was one of BT's leading thinkers and practitioners in the management of data. Some really significant things Kevin has been involved with, including the development and deployment of BT's current call center knowledge management solution, which was deployed to more than 14,000 agents across 30 centers in 2 continents. He was also key in developing the backbone for many digital platforms, including BT.com, Cable and Wireless's IP and data provisioning platform, as well as the immersive technology behind TUI's brands First Choice and Thomson. So really, really, Kevin has been in the trenches, if you like, but, on the one hand, but he's also been, I guess, leading the troops, both from the front, as helping them span what needs to be done. Most recently, Kevin has been working in the not-for-profit sector and charity sector in the UK, helping organizations deliver their digital strategies. In 2019, Kevin joined Cats Protection as their executive director for digital transformation. And in that time, he has been the driving force behind the digital strategy. And among other things, has delivered new revenue channels for the charity, really modernizing that space, and also created quite a useful and crucial enabling platform as the charity now seeks to implement its broader 10-year strategy. It is my real privilege to welcome Kevin and Mark today. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Opie.
Thank you.
Well, actually, Mark, I really wanted to start today's session, with you, because one of the key things that struck me, we've worked together some time. One of the key things that struck me is that you joined the UK higher education sector from a private sector background. And I wondered whether you have any reflections in terms of when you came in from private sector into UK higher education. Were you clear that you were going into the UEA to deliver digital transformation, or was that a realization you came to subsequently? How did the whole idea of digital transformation come to be?
Thanks, Opie. So whilst I was given a clear mandate, I was actually hired with digital transformation in mind to create a digital strategy. But I also had an outline plan, a plan of action, if you will, which included getting a better understanding of the context together with experience and expectations of customers and users. So I had some of that before I joined, but very much, I guess any of us starting a new role would want to do that. And I quickly came to realize that there were some big things that needed to be addressed before we could move forward. For example, project delivery outcomes were very inconsistent. There was no single view of project workloads for the technical team, and there was no resource allocation within the team as well. So you can imagine that sort of basic set of processes led to inconsistent quality. There are also gaps in the IT operating model, probably the most notable being concerning architecture. So there were no architecture principles to help guide technology decisions. And finally, both the culture within the business and IT wasn't enough of being in the right place to be able to start transformation or start to develop a digital strategy. Essentially, there was a lack of belief and probably innovation ideas as well. So there was lots of work, but you wouldn't say that work was very innovative from a business point of view. So those were kind of that was the context and the foundations that I had to build upon. So the kind of initial period of work was to address those foundations to make them more solid.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. So, I mean, having kind of come to that realization, you had all of these challenges, these gaps. How did you go about thinking about the transformation journey in itself? And in particular, I would really like you to reflect on that in the context of culture. How did you kind of think about the transformation journey and what you need to do in terms of ensuring it aligned with, or certainly took account of, the culture in the university, which I suspect was very different to the culture, say, for example, at Boots, where you were coming from?
Yeah, it was very, very different. And, you know, my focus, although my approach and my focus was probably not too dissimilar. So I always think that the focus has to be on people. And I identified 4 groups very early on. 2 sets of customers. So one being students, one being academics. Then the leaders of the institution itself and the delivery team, so the IT team itself. So those 4 groups was a real focus for me. And a plan was created for each, aimed at delivering a series of outcomes. And culture was a big part of the plan for all of those groups. But for the IT team, the change was probably the biggest, and involved a shift in leadership culture and a focus on quality outcomes for customers. So even the phrase customers was a big change within the team. So coming from retail, you know, and a company like Boots with, you know, with over 100 years of culture, it was very clear about customers, and you know, right the way through the organisation. So we had to rework some of that within the organisation. Alongside that, we also I asked the team to re-engineer some key processes, some of which we worked with Maxica over. The primary one being those processes around projects and managing projects. So we created a PMO with Maxica's help, and that was very much with customer outcomes in mind. You know, what we wanted was consistency. We wanted to be able to confidently say, yes, we'll take this project on and we will deliver it. And we all know that that in itself is a challenge, but without the right processes, just becomes impossible to do. I also arranged for greater engagement with academics through some existing groups that were existing, but I also created a mission for myself to meet many academics on a one-to-one basis, and some of those relationships continue throughout my tenure at the university. And that kind of listening process was what I was looking for then, you know, sort of feedback coming back in about not only how were we doing, but where should we be going, you know, what was important. And then I was probably the last thing we did is we did do some I called them sort of art of the possible sessions. So, and these were kind of facilitated sessions where opportunities, some of them quite way out opportunities, were discussed, and we then summarised the outcomes and took those and synthesised them and took them into meetings with the executive team and council. And the goal there was to start to stimulate people's thinking, whilst alongside that we were fixing some of the basic service issues, such as the project delivery that I mentioned as well.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. I mean, Kevin, I wanted to come to you now, really, and just reflect. I mean, there's obviously some similarities, some differences between, you know, your work at Cats Protection and Mark's. But I really wanted to just pick up a little bit more this culture question, because in a sense, you know, I mean, there is that common saying, isn't there, that culture eats strategy for breakfast or lunch, you know, whatever it is you want to kind of call it. But, you know, it's important. And within the charity sector in particular, and I think this is quite transferable to other sectors, you have quite an interesting constituent among your stakeholder base, which in a sense you don't really have that much control over. You've got volunteers. Do you want to talk a little bit about your journey and how you went about the cultural considerations for your transformation approach, you know, given, you know, the nature of stakeholders you needed to engage with?
Yeah, I think like Mark, you know, you start to look at the constituencies that actually drive work into your organisation. You know, and we've got, you know, the executive team and the projects, and but we do have the volunteers, and it's fair to say that even though we are primarily a volunteer-led organisation, and led is probably a stronger word than we would normally like to use. Actually, we didn't consider them in the way that we should have done. So it was almost become a blind spot for us in terms of how do we engage and to a point where we actually had categorized volunteers and staff, and actually we were designing things for staff with very little consideration for the volunteer community, but they make up more than 50% of the work that we do. Well, I think in anyone's books, you'd probably say, well, that needs to be rebalanced, and the way that was considered and brought into the thinking was a fundamental shift for us in terms of the way that we were both designing our solutions. And again, a bit like Mark, we didn't have many of those design principles there. So the maturity of IT needed to grow as we wanted to grow as a charity. And bringing in that new dimension was a real challenge for people, because it's difficult, because volunteers don't give their time primarily through 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, where most of the offices are actually open. They give us the time when they can give us the time. So how do you change the mentality of your business analysts, who typically would want to work on the Monday to Friday, to say, well, actually, we've got a big community of people out there. Now, very fortuitously, we've got a very good volunteer organization that engages with volunteers, and we were able to run focus groups and design sessions with them specifically for them. So they read and felt really part of the process. But it's really hard, because often some of the things you have to design, they may never ever get to use, because they're part of our sort of governance framework, etc. But they need to know it's there. So it's one of those things that you have to have this fine balancing line between what's really important for them, because they're giving their time for free, and really maximizing that investment, but also highlighting to them the governance that the charity has to operate under, because that's governed by the Charity Commission. So getting that balance right has not always been easy, and it's fair to say, you talked about battle scars. I think sometimes we've probably got it wrong. But a volunteer community don't hold back in terms of that messaging, in terms of, yes, this is not working, this is working. Ultimately, we have started to blend those together. We no longer refer to them as volunteers. They're just people who consume our services. It doesn't matter whether or not you're a volunteer. It matters to nobody, really, particularly if you have to resolve a particular problem on the service desk. And that's one of those other things that we had to consider, obviously, as we started to roll out the digital services, as to how those services are going to be serviced. Because culturally, we've been a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 operation. Well, that's no longer the operation that our people actually need. It's actually a 7-day operation, often till very late in the evenings. So we've had to really look at how we provide those services in the same way that Mark did, and start to look at the demand for them, and start to develop those services in a way that meets all of the community needs, rather than just those that are easy to service.
That's a great point, Kevin. Actually, there were a number of things that, while you were speaking there, which kind of got me thinking. One of the key aspects that needs to be considered when you're thinking about digital transformation, or transformation, or any real change, it can be so easy to overlook the different constituents that you have. But governance, and the way you set up the governance of the change initiative, or of your transformation program, can be quite an important part of getting this right. And many people sort of tend to think about governance, having a project board, or a program board, or program steering committee. But actually, governance and considerations for governance, you should really start much sooner in the thinking around transformation. And I just wondered, whether you had any reflections on kind of getting the right kind of governance in place, early on in the transformation journey. Kevin, if I kind of stick with you for a second and say, can you talk a little bit about some of your thinking in that space, getting the governance early on in the transformation journey?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we didn't have a huge amount of governance, but even though we're a sort of regulated charity, like many charities are, the governance needed to add value. And I think, and again, a little bit of cultural history, I think where governance has been applied previously. It's always been seen as a sort of a stick. It's always been seen as something that you have to deliver, but it doesn't really add a huge amount of value. And what I really wanted to do in the early days of thinking, particularly with the executive team, is really start to get them to understand the value of governance. It's intertwined with successful delivery that Mark was referring to. It becomes one of those cornerstones of success, but it's not just a tick box exercise, which often it can become. And what I had to do, and again, every organization is slightly different, is you have to really earn some stripes. You have to show some value in the early days, so that people go, now I get what we mean by governance. It's no longer just the form filling. It's not just the project board. It's actually providing tangible value. And if you can find some nuggets early on when you start to bring some of that together, and the big one for us was about dependency management, flagging up that the impact on the organization. And if we didn't do something about it, then we potentially could be pushing the organization into change overload, where there's too much going on, too many things happening, and all it takes is one of the dominoes to fall over in the wrong direction, and then it all falls apart. That became really, really valuable to us, early thinking. And I know you know this because we engaged you to help us with some of the aspects of that. The setting up, as I say, of a structure, I think you could take out of any textbook, but it's actually how you bring it to life for people in your organization, and understanding that culture as to why some things will work and some things won't work. And I suppose any bit of advice, that people will give is you really need to understand the heritage of your organization to understand what's going to float people's boats and probably not going to float people's boats, or what's going to add value and not going to add value. And I think you've got to earn some stripes before you get almost a privilege to be able to lead that conversation forward a bit.
That's great. Mark, I wanted to come to you. Thank you so much, Kevin. Really interesting, because again, the diversity of constituents, in a sense, that you've got in UKHE, you've got students, even academics are a really broad church, if you like. You've got researchers, you've got, those who are in teaching and learning, kind of this really broad spectrum. Do you want to kind of talk a little bit about, how you constitute, the membership, I guess, when you're thinking about the inputs into that governance structure and the operation of that governance structure? Do you want to kind of share some thoughts about how you went about doing that for the program at the university?
Sure. I guess to start with, I'd echo Kevin's comments, really, that the earlier you can get started on governance, the better. And I'd similarly had sort of inherited some forum which weren't really kind of working effectively. Lots of people in them. It was a tick boxing exercise, in my view, and it was engaged in a lot of time was engaged in transactional discussions. So the idea was to kind of lift that up. So I reviewed that very early on, and actually I got agreement to trim it right down to its kind of bare essentials. Some of that was needed. We still, even though we had more project work that we could handle, we still needed to prioritize. You still needed to do that, and that was and felt very transactional to start with. But that had to evolve, really, because we're all probably facing the same challenge of scarce resources with lots of different work to do, some of it feeling, as I say, quite transactional, and some of it perhaps more strategic. So how do you get the balance for that? Where can you direct those scarce resources where they're giving the business the most benefit? So for transformation, we started to evolve the governance, and I'll talk sort of very specifically about what we did. So we did create a steering group. Sounds a grand name, and I was very fortunate to have a chair of council who was willing to chair that group. So immediately that lifted the kind of higher level body up, and we carefully selected members of that group, which were representative of of the university. That included people from the student union as well. So, but it immediately kind of lifted the conversation more to a strategic level. What was really important then was to have two subgroups effectively supporting that work. So we did have a program group, which was then more about sort of sequencing and prioritizing and allocation of resources. And we had an architecture group, which actually had a mix of people on, not just IT people. And again, that was a really positive move to have some realization that we needed some architectural principles to help guide the work we were doing. So that was essentially the structure, we started this as the business case wasn't fully completed, and was we were probably a month or so away from starting its process of approval. So and it was important to do that because these things need tweaks. Sometimes people aren't a good fit, or you have to work on the agenda, and these things are all you're trying to find a drumbeat of how you make these things work and how you prove value. So there was a lot of retrospective sort of analysis going on through that time as well. So that gave us the sort of basis, OP, I would say. The one thing I would add is it also gave us some time to work with the members of those groups, particularly the steering group. And so we did engage a specialist who had in this space that had sort of worked with a number of organisations, including the Houses of Parliament, as they were going through their digital transformation, which was part of the Palace of Westminster's physical transformation, if you like, or upgrade. And we had some sessions actually with some of the people from the Houses of Parliament project programme, and they proved to be really valuable because they started to some of the challenges were very similar, from an institution like the Houses of Parliament to a university based in Norwich. And that was really valuable to start to help people understand what it is they were hearing and what they needed to, how they needed to kind of digest that information, right down to the sorts of questions to ask. So yeah, so that in short, that's how we did it.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I mean, some really, it brings a smile to my face just thinking about some of the things that we needed to do there. And actually, you touched on a number of things, which again, I know Kevin mentioned before. And I want to really come back to you, Kevin, because quite often digital transformation programs almost start as a fait accompli. Lots of people, like you've kind of said before, it does need to earn its own stripes. It needs to earn its right to exist. And because I guess of the statistics or just the general understanding or expectation, many people when they hear digital transformation are turned off, think it's going to fail, it's doomed to failure, never going to happen. I guess I wanted to get your thoughts on, again, still getting that broader stakeholder engagement, getting the broader stakeholders brought in. And you talked earlier on, Kevin, about earning your stripes. One of the things that we've done, I know we did a little bit with you, we did with the UEA, is to think about these idea of lighthouse projects, or these projects that kind of give a sense, for what the art of the possible can be. And you did some really interesting things, Kevin, when we worked together on the service excellence project at CATS Protection. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you did as part of that project in particular, and how this helped to build credibility for the wider transformation?
Yeah, I can do, and I will. I just want to come back on something that Mark was talking about, particularly about the architecture. It never ceases to amaze me how organisations can be blind spotted to things that are absolutely fundamental, and if whatever digital transformation you want to bring. We were the same. We didn't have an architecture function. We did architecture, but we did it fairly light touch, where really it needed a lot more heavyweight involvement. And the other big bit for us is we didn't have any data principles. We went back to my introduction, where do I come from? I come from a data background, data scientist type background. So if you've got none of those ground rules embedded, it makes life a little bit difficult, particularly for the delivery teams, because they've got no lighthouse, as you just described it there, to aim for. They've got no shining light. So it becomes incredibly difficult for them to operate strategically. They can fix problems, but they become subsequent problems because they haven't really thought it through, because they didn't have the time or they didn't have the capability. And some of the service excellence projects were actually there to break down some of that, so that we can start to see, I hate to use the phrase wood for trees because they're a supplier of ours, but you can start to see the direction of travel that you want to go. And specifically, the service itself provided by IT at that particular time was not robust enough, not reliable enough to deliver the strategic solutions that we wanted to. So, like many places, you have to take a look at the processes, getting that pipeline, understanding your ability to deliver against that pipeline. Recognize that pipeline is going to change, because change is inevitable, because that's what we do. We're all change agents. But specifically as well, we were looking at that service, that service that we were offering to the organization, and it had to be redesigned. It was as simple as that, because the feedback from all of the constituents was that it didn't meet what they were expecting. It was okay, but it was nowhere near going to be good enough for the level of transformation that we wanted to go through. So we had to redesign everything from PMO, how do you get working, how do you evaluate it, how do you then rank it and prioritize it, right through to managing the delivery of that process to an agreed timeline and budget as well. So yeah, those service excellence programs were built up of those foundational capabilities that you would expect in all organizations. But time and time again, I think in my career, I've gone in and gone, yeah, it's running to a cadence, but is that the same cadence that the business wanted to run? And it certainly wasn't like that at TUI in the commercial sector, and that needed to get faster. And in the non-for-profit sector, it seems to often run at its own pace. It has its own engine of things that it wants to do, but then they've got a constituency that's going, well, I need you to do this, but I can't. But then you get this conflict that I can't do that because they haven't done this, and it becomes a conundrum. And you've got to break through that conundrum. And I know those difficult conversations we had with some constituents that said, you've got to give us some time, because essentially we're going to have to unravel this and build it back up again. And the hardest thing was stopping some projects that were ill thought through, if I'm honest. But that's the courageousness that you have to take sometimes. And you've got to go out there and say, this isn't going to deliver you what you expected it to deliver. And sometimes that gives you the headspace then to go and focus on things that actually will delight customers. And as you said in the introduction, we were able to move into new areas of fundraising. Gaming for Good is a growth area that is pretty underutilized, particularly in the non-for-profit sector for fundraising and support. We were one of the first to take full advantage of that, and it's a growing and sustainable income stream for us now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kevin. Mark, I wanted to build on some of the things that Kevin was discussing now and really think about some of the big shocks, which kind of set the broader context in which every organization is doing transformation. A few years ago, it only feels like yesterday on one hand, we had the COVID-19 outbreak, which I know you did a lot of work on with the university to lead its response. But actually, even now, we are kind of still living with the effects of the pandemic. But added to that, of course, there are the new pressures, whether it's the cost of living or the rise of artificial intelligence or AR, or assisted AI, if you like, political instability, both here in the UK, leading to an uncertain investment environment, the things happening on our doorstep in Europe, with the war in Ukraine. There is a lot going on, which is affecting the ability of businesses, to invest and to have certainty. And so, organizations and so on need to be flexible when thinking about, how to transform or how to, implement significant change. And I just wondered, Mark, if you had any reflections on how embracing agile principles can help organizations design their transformation programs for, for success. Both thinking about this in terms of the strategy and the resourcing. Any thoughts there? Mark, I think you're on mute still.
Thank you, Opie. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think the COVID or coronavirus pandemic is a good example of that. So, I by sort of the end of 2019, early 2020, we had a really good grapple on our projects. But of course, something as big as that just changes your context completely. And so, that's where something like Agile comes in. I mean, we use terms like backlog, and we were refining that backlog, and coming up with prioritization and then sequencing of projects, and it got turned on its head a bit. So, but by sticking with sort of Agile principles, you started to collect new projects effectively, and in our case, accelerating projects initiatives was probably the key at that point. A really good example of that was yes, sometimes in the public sector, and it was particularly true of our university. Things can take a bit of time. Projects can take a bit of time to achieve. People have to adjust, and we give them time to do that. And one of those projects was to do with online assessments and exams. So, it had taken the university, I think, almost 5 years to achieve about 1/3 of its assessments and exams to be online by the time we got to 2020. And we'd kind of, we had a steering group set up, and we were given permission to have some initiative to drive it forwards, and we still thought it would take another 18 months to get to somewhere near 100%, and we didn't think 100% was achievable, to be honest. And then the pandemic started, and students weren't allowed to sit in rooms and be on campus and what have you. So so in a matter of weeks, perhaps a couple of months, we got to 100%. Literally in a way that we just hadn't seen before. And I have to say, some people really pulled out the stops to do that, but the academics particularly had to adjust very, very quickly. And essentially, they had to adopt the change very, very quickly because there was a burning platform. It was the only way assignments and particularly exams were going to take place. And we had a number of those where we accelerated a number of projects that were either slowly in train, and we accelerated them forwards, and others that we brought forwards completely from, they may have been 18 months away from starting. And one of those was moving our learning platform to a cloud offering, which was a kind of next year type project, had been a next year project for a number of years, kept moving backwards. And we did that by the start of the new term in September. So, we took again a matter of months to do something that we hadn't really got off the planning board. So I think that kind of, it does sound, I do feel a little bit guilty saying this around there are benefits from something as dreadful as a pandemic. But it does change the context, and and many of the things you spoke about, OP, would change an organization's context. And I think it's important to be in tune with that, and then using sort of agile principles to kind of restack and reprioritize the work you have in front of you.
Yeah. I mean, Kevin, one of the things that you've done, thanks, Mark, one of the things that you did at CP, really, and I'm going to have to ask you, please, just to keep your answers to this one brief, because we've got to round this section up and move to the next one, was really thinking about how the as-a-service models can help with, building in that flexibility of approach. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how that's helped you at Catch Protection?
Yeah, I think Mark was talking about sort of trying to plan for the event, every eventuality. Well, you can't. Stuff's going to happen, And what you realise very, very quickly is you don't have the capacity or the capability to respond to that all the time, even if you were to take the most drastic prioritisation, and therefore you have to have a flex model. It's as simple as that. In the charity sector, it's not particularly well developed as a whole. In other sectors, it's probably more developed. So having to do that at Cats Protection, and working, again, as you know, with yourselves, we were able to develop a number of flexible delivery models, both around the project management as a service, quick projects that come in and go quite quickly. You just don't have the capacity to pick them up and deliver them. And keeping what you believe in as essential, but then supplementing it with agile resourcing, agile capability, and it's not just about the resourcing; it's about capability. It's about having that mindset shift as well. Does really give you, a lot of extra capabilities that you would actually think you would do at the start of something like a pandemic or any other of those crises. And like every organization out there, we're seeing the raw cost of materials for us go up quite substantially. We have a donor base, and responding to that, you've got to have that agile capability. Otherwise, quite simply, as Mark was describing, you have these projects that sit on the project list that really never get anywhere. They always sit on there. They're always there as a lag to you, and then ultimately they'll become a real barrier. So they'll have a lag effect for a while, but then subsequently they will become barriers. And certainly we experienced that as we went through both the pandemic and coming out of it. We had all of those elements in, and you just need that flexibility, really.
Yeah, Kevin, I really wish we had a bit more time to discuss this, because there's lots of things to talk about, even how we've built in that, agility into your architecture model, done the same, at the UEA, to kind of give the right capabilities at the right time. But I'm afraid, sadly, that's all we've got time for in this discussion session. There are a few questions in the panel. I just want to say to the audience that we will, just before we take questions, as we begin to take questions, there's a poll that's come up. If I kindly ask you to please respond to the poll, it'll be very useful insight, and we can then share that, subsequently, as well. But let's take our first question now. I've got someone who said, my organization is facing challenges around limited resourcing to drive the transformation changes needed. How have the panel addressed challenges like this? I think, Kevin, that was what you were talking about a moment ago. Mark, do you have anything else to add to that?
Perhaps only just being really clear about the business case, and building that and finding a way of bringing that into kind of senior level discussions, because these things require investment. Similar to if your building was falling down or needed maintenance, you would have to do the same sort of thing. So being really clear about the business case, OP.
Yeah, thank you. Can I come to you again, Kevin? There's a question which says, what role does leadership play in driving digital transformation success?
Personally, I think
if I actually colour that, forgive me, if I colour that a little bit, because actually sometimes, people like those of us on this panel might have, good ideas about, about what we need to do, but how do you influence other leaders, in that regard, to drive their transformation success?
Leadership is fundamental in any form of transformation, whether or not it's digital or anything else. And your role as a leader is not just leading from the front in your own discipline. It's about influencing those that sit alongside you, that sit underneath you and across your organization into some of those constituencies that we talked about, particularly in my case, that volunteer base. So you are out there, you are talking to people, you are listening, you are absorbing, you are reflecting back, as Mark was talking about, whether or not it's those one-to-one sessions or whether or not it's group sessions. Influence is not on a one-to-one basis, or can be, but it's also pervasive through everything that you do. So leadership by example, is a very broad contextual statement that says it's everything that you do, every interaction you potentially can have is an opportunity to influence somebody to think and see the opportunities that might be there, or certainly overcome some of the problems they might be experiencing. I don't know if Mark wants to add anything to that.
Just to agree, Kevin, I think, that I referenced it, understanding who your colleagues are, who your partners are, and you'll understand, kind of which stage they're at. I mean, there's some people where you're trying to help them shape their ideas, and maybe even sequence their ideas, and there are others who are kind of a little bit way back, and what they're looking for is some inspiration. So understanding your relationships and how you can help, I think is probably the most fundamental thing to do with colleagues that are leaders as well.
Naturally, that's a really great segue into another question that someone's asked. I think it's a great one, which is what role does change management play in driving successful digital transformation? Now, can I just add to this question that we, in the live poll, as it stands, actually it's changed just in the last moment. Resistance to change was neck and neck with limited resource and budget. Just now, actually, though, limited resource and budget has kind of sped into the lead, but kind of, nonetheless, resistance to change is kind of sort of the second top reason highlighted by the audience in terms of those things impacting digital transformation. So, I guess there's change management in a number of different contexts, but how do you what role do you think change management plays there at the big level, but also at the little levels, if you like, in terms of driving digital transformation? Mark, can I come to you, please?
Yeah, sure. And I'll take perhaps the big picture question on that one first, OP. So it's pretty fundamental. In fact, I'm not I suppose resistance to change, you could read as a different, you could interpret that differently, because a lot of the resistance, I think, comes from a number of things. It can come from fear. It can come from lack of confidence. So it's really important from a change management point of view that you understand where that resistance is coming from. If I'm sure there's probably a kind of physics analogy to this that I can't think of, but if you just keep hitting something as hard as you can and there's resistance, you're not going to get anywhere. So you have to, I think, understand it and then help people kind of process what's happening. I mean, Kevin said earlier, change is inevitable. You may not be looking for change, but change is certainly looking for you. So I think from that side, it's really critical. And I think clearly, if you take it at the micro level, I've been involved in enough critical business outages that have been related to change. I think probably half of the ones I've been involved in have been that. So that probably just speaks for itself. Make sure you've got good technical change management in place if you want to get some sleep.
That's right. Okay. Kevin, were you quite keen to add something?
I think so. If you think about change management, there is an organizational perspective, and it's understanding your organization, that organizational history. Some organizations do change quite frequently because they've got new products coming to market. They've got new initiatives going on. Travel, for example, we've got new destinations. Everything is changing every season. Some organizations don't change that much, and therefore the inertia to get that change, which might be behind the question, is much more difficult. And I know that when we started to look at this at CATS Protection, actually just a very simple thing that says, change, where are you on this spectrum? And I had the senior leaders and got them all out and stood them on a line. And actually you had everything from people who hated it because they were, hadn't been involved in it, to the people that were desperate for it. And what you've got to try and do is maneuver, as Mark was saying, about understanding why people are resistant to change who are on that end of the scale, but also try and satisfy the people at the other end of the scale in some degree as well. So it's a fine balancing act, but I think if you know where you're starting from, if you understand the landscape, it does make it easier in terms of devising what the next strategy or the next step in that strategy might be.
Fabulous. I love that point. Know where you're starting from. And actually, again, really good way to go into what will be, in a sense, for us here from yourselves. Can I just ask each of you, say to the audience, unfortunately, we've kind of run out of time to take more questions, but actually, here's the icing on the cake, in a sense. Can I come to you both, Kevin, first? I'll start with you. What would be your top 3 tips for someone who is contemplating or in the midst of digital transformation? What will be your top 3 tips for them to kind of bear in mind as they embark on that or go through that?
I think we've touched on them today, but it's amplifying them here. The first is understand those constituents, where the change is necessary and where it's needed. Make sure you can develop the capability to deliver it, whether or not that would be architecture, PMO, whatever it would be. Just look at what I use the phrase set yourself up for success, because it's your success. I know the business will benefit from it, but the reality is that you've got that personal brand association. And understand what level of governance you're going to need for your organization, and flexibility as well. So no real rocket science in there, take it out and remember, but based on experience, are really, really fundamental.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kevin. I really appreciate that. Mark, can I come to you and ask you for your, what 3 words, what 3 things should organizations remember?
Sure, OP. So I think my first one is get a read and understand your context, and continue to do that as it will change, and feed that into your processes. The second one for me is get the basics in place. So and implied there is understand what the basics are. And I always have a term that says that they've got to be good enough. It does, you're not looking for perfection here, but this could be process. It could be development of people, training, any number of things. But you need to understand what basics need to be in place in your organization to be able to make a start in earnest. And then the third one for me is, no surprise, is governance as well. And I use the phrase fit for purpose. So again, depending on your organization, and focus on the outcomes. Governance, so many times people, you've got to think about the value. Kevin said it earlier, the value that it's adding, and it does add value. In some organizations, it's absolutely essential. In most organizations, so make it fit for purpose, and that will work for you.
That's great. Thanks, Mark. And I guess on that point you were talking about there, one of the things that is worth just mentioning, because I've just spoiled, we've got a couple more minutes. One question which I can just sneak in, just hopefully trying to do my best for the audience here, is really thinking about, we've done our strategy, we've done our execution, we've set ourselves up for success in a sense, but actually many transformation programs are multi-year, and it can be quite difficult really to to be seeing that wholesale value mid-flight. But do you want to say something about the role of independent project assurance and how that might be able to sort of help us while we are mid-flight to link delivery to value? Kevin, do you want to say a few words there?
Briefly, because I know we're short of time, we've taken advantage of that, but also not losing track of those benefits as well. So part of the function of the PMO is benefits realization, and as you've just described, sometimes those benefits are coming in year 3 and year 4, and certainly are in our case as we've gone through some substantial investments. So checking in to make sure that that value is going to be realized in year 3 just maintains that credibility and confidence that it's coming. It's not jammed for tomorrow. It is coming. It's been verified. It's delivering what it will do. You just don't see it on the bottom line, or you just don't see it in your P&L until it's actually realized and those orders are coming through. So it's that little confidence, in that cadence every so often just boosts people to say, yeah, do you know what? We'll get it. It's coming. you may not be visible to you in the way that you would like it to just at the minute. So for me, it's been extremely helpful, extremely valuable, and it's something I continue to do because I just think it's just a good thing to do.
Absolutely. Well, that's fantastic. Well, I think it's probably not too bad a place to leave it. Just a few closing reflections to say a sincere, heartfelt thanks to you both. The webinar again will be available on demand on LinkedIn shortly after the session. Thank you all very much for your engagement in the polls as well. So we've got the results of the poll. The top reason cited by people as the biggest challenge is limited resources and budget is the key thing. Of course, the ability to flex, with an as-a-service model, I think, can help significantly there. Resistance to change is the runner-up. I think we've talked a little bit about that. And then finally, lack of leadership commitment, I think, were the top three reasons cited by people. Interestingly, actually, the systems or IT challenges were not ranked as highly, because I think the understanding is that if the will is there, if the leadership is there, if the resources are there, then actually those are some amounts of performance, which I completely, agree with. So I really want to thank everyone. I will just recap to everyone that you can download this on LinkedIn and on the Maxica website, www.maxica.com. The top three tips that both Kevin and Mark shared, again, know where you're starting from, set yourself up for success, ensure the right governance is in place. I think that's probably a really great summary. Thank you all very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure hosting this webinar, and hopefully we'll see you all again in the future. Many thanks.
Thanks, Opie.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Opie. Thank you.